I'm here to talk to you now about writing successful funding applications. I just want you to ponder the slide that you can see in front of you, look carefully at it, and then decide how you might judge me as a person. I think if you were feeling generous, you might thought, well, she might have gone to bed rather late last night. She must be very tired. She must have done it in a hurry. If you were ungenerous, you might think, oh, she's a bit sloppy. I don't know whether I want to give her £750,000 of our money. It's just an example, really, of how first impressions count. Obviously, what we're looking for is something more like that, without any spelling mistakes. So for the next, I don't know, 40 minutes, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the sort of writerly aspects of grant applications. And I thought it would be helpful to start with some tips from the top. Obviously, the message from that is don't submit something if it's your first draft, because it isn't likely to be very good. One day I'll find the right words and they will be simple, from Jack Kerouac. Again, you know, we've learnt this morning already, I think, that quite often when we're writing for a funding panel or reviewers who aren't necessarily conversant with our area, and it's important to make sure that the language is simple and that you can communicate exactly what you want to communicate in a way that everyone will understand. The first sentence of a book is a handshake, perhaps an embrace, from Jhumpa Lahiri. A very important point to make. Again, first impressions count, but also you need to hook your reader, make sure they're drawn into your application. And importantly, if we have another quotation here from Jane Austen, keep you reading. So my own part of the book is well written, I find it too short, so they want to keep reading. So that's something else you've got to do when you're writing your grant application. Fill your paper with the breathings of your heart, perhaps a bit too flowery and poetic, but in fact for some grant applications, that kind of edge of enthusiasm and passion is important, especially in fellowship applications. We've got, I can write with authority only about what I know well, from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Very important. You know, we're not applying for vast sums of money from somebody if we don't know really what we're doing. You can't rush inspiration. It takes time to write these things. Don't be crushed by other people's gatekeeping, from Bernadette Evaristo. That said, take a good look at your work and make sure it's publishable and it's going to stand out. I think we can learn from that. If you do get any feedback from applications, we've heard about many rejected applications. It is part and parcel of applying for research funding. Look and see what people have said. If they've misunderstood, why have they misunderstood? It could be that it's not very well written. If they've got other things to suggest, then look at them carefully. They may be wise suggestions and you need to take them on board if you're sending the application back into the same funder. I love deadlines. I love the whooshing noise they make as they go by, a very famous quote by Douglas Adams. Yes, deadlines are there. If you want to put in for that round, you have to get it in by that deadline. However, a lot of these funding schemes do have very regular programs and deadlines, and if you miss one deadline because your application isn't quite as good as it could be, that's probably a good thing, unless, of course, you have other commercial or indeed academic interests that require you to get funding in by a certain time. And I do appreciate some people do have those sort of issues that need to be attended to. So just a few quotes about writing generally and how we can apply those quotes to writing grants. I think there are a number of things you need to consider when you're putting in a grant application. The first is, who are you writing for? So who is your audience? Well, actually, when you write a grant application, you have lots of different sorts of audiences, and that's where the skill in writing comes in. Firstly, you will have some detailed readers. So the people who perhaps receive your application when it's sent out to peer review. Not all funding schemes do that, but a lot of them do. And so if there are lots of large amounts of money concerned, it will go out to scientific peer review. They're going to be reading your application in great detail. And it may be that they are subject experts who know your field. It may be that they're methodology reviewers who will be doing a deep dive into your methodology sections. Either way, these people are going to be looking in detail at what you're written, and they will expect a level of professionalism and expertise if money is going to be changing hands. Secondly, you have your speed readers. So it may be that there's an initial scrutiny committee, or it may be a panel who some of whom will have read it in detail, your application, others of whom may have read it in a big hurry on the train on the way there. For both of those people, you've got to get your important messages across, even if they're reading it really quickly. So you have to provide nice, digestible writing that speed readers will pick up on, and there are various techniques we can use to ensure that that happens. The initial scrutiny committee might be a remit check. So again, these people may have read applications quite speedily just to look at the remit, in which case that has to shout out. So you need to make it very clear that your application does fit the remit of the funder. You'll also have readers who are new to your subject. Now, that may be the lay readers who are sitting on a panel, or indeed there are lay reviewers quite often who would be doing a peer review on your application. They're not going to know your subject area necessarily, or if as a lay reviewer, they may know it as a patient or a person with lived experience. But also on the panel, you're going to have methodologists and clinicians, especially on an NIHR panel, who are going to be really new to your area. And you need to be able to get them to understand it, get what you're doing, and be on side throughout the discussion. Now, obviously, there are some funders like the MRC who have particular boards, and they may have slightly more reviewers, I suppose, who are more familiar broadly with the subject area. But having said that, even for those people, given that research is quite often very niche, they're not necessarily going to be experts in your particular specific area. Importantly, you're going to have busy people looking at your application. You've got to make it absolutely as easy as possible for them to pick up on all the important things you want them to have. So the second thing to consider is, well, what do they want? What do these various people want? Well, if we look at the Research Funding Toolkit, which is by Aldridge and Derrington, it's quite a good read, actually. It sort of opened my eyes to grant writing techniques. They suggest 4 key propositions. Firstly, the importance proposition. So this project is important. The success proposition. This project can answer the question. The value proposition, this project is good value for money. And the competence proposition, this applicant and team can deliver. And they argue that everything you include should actually support one or more of these propositions when you're writing. So the prerequisites for a successful funding application are firstly to recognise it as a competitive sales pitch, which is probably easier for SMEs to understand perhaps than academics, but it's a competitive sales pitch aimed at convincing a particular funder that your idea is important to them. So important to them. You could have a brilliant research project, but if it's not important to the funder, it's not within the funder's remit, they're not actually going to want to be funding it. That your suggested approach will deliver something meaningful, that what they get will be good value for money, that you and your institution are eligible for funding and your team are competent to support you. Obviously, if your own institution is not eligible for funding, you can collaborate with an institution that is. And finally, you're able to write a well-crafted, understandable description of your work plan that will convince funders of all of the above. So the problem with getting research funding is that to get through these initial hoops, it's all in the writing. So that's got to be well done. So a funding application like a picture should not be jumbled up, unclear, difficult to decipher, confusing or unconvincing. It should be clear, unambiguous, easy on the eye, easy on the brain, and convincing. So it's got to be something that looks good. It's got to be something that is palatable, i.e. it's easy to read, easy to digest, easy to get the main meaning and messages. So it's not just what you write, it's the way that you write it. So what makes a good research funding application? I think there are a number of things, and I've called them all S's. So the first thing is substance, the second is symmetry, the third is story, the fourth is style, the fifth is sales pitch, and finally, the summary. And I'm going to talk about all of those things. So firstly, substance. So you heard earlier from Lisa about research questions and how to refine them. So what is a good research question? Well, firstly, it's got to be important to the funder. It's got to be novel, because that's what research is all about. It's got to be useful, and it's got to be researchable. Actually, not everything is researchable. So if we want to find out about what is important to the funder, we can look at their mission, we can look at their aims and objectives, we can look at the sorts of projects they funded in the past, we can look at their eligibility criteria and their guidance notes. So there's no point pitching a brilliant grant application to a funder who's not interested in your area. It's got to be researchable. So will the proposed study methods answer the question? So will the research plan deliver? Is it appropriate and scientifically rigorous? Is the plan feasible? and will it deliver useful outputs? Those are the sorts of things that people are going to be wanting to know in terms of the researchability and the substance of your application. It's important in your application to demonstrate your thinking. So answer all questions that might be asked of your written application. If you imagine a reviewer reading through your grant application, when they read something and they've got a bit of a niggle, it will bubble up in their head and it will stay there as a query and a niggle. You have to get rid of that. So you mustn't hide things under the carpet. No research design is perfect. You need to be upfront with any limitations. You need to preempt criticism and confront it. So you're acknowledging weaknesses. You either remove it by better design or you mitigate it where it's possible. And obviously, if you're using an approach, particularly if it's an unusual approach, you need to say why you're using it and why it's better than perhaps what might be, the obvious research design might be. So it's important to be upfront with the limitations of your project. We all know that every project has its limitations, but at the same time, you want to mitigate any worries that a reviewer may be accumulating in their brain as they read your application. So by the end of it, they're thoroughly on board with you. So you don't want this, a flimsy research application that could be easily blown down by a big, mean wolf reviewer. You want this, a nice, sturdy application that will withstand all the attacks that a reviewer might decide to put on it. Also, in terms of substance, you need to be a credible applicant. So you need to be applying for award at the right level for you in terms of your background, expertise, and track record. Now, obviously, a lot of projects, especially IFI projects, are going to be very much team-based projects. And you remember Ronan mentioning how he managed to get quite a senior academic to be a co-PI with him. If the NIHR or Innovate UK are going to invest a lot of money in you, they want to know it's in good hands. So you do need to have the team on board who can show they've got the track record, that they have managed substantial projects before and delivered successful outputs. There are other schemes, obviously, that NIHR and others run that are pitched at people who are less experienced, but it's unlikely to be a large eye for eye project. You need to have support to cover all major methodological or other important areas. So, you need to have a team that covers all your bases. If you've got a big statistical component to your work and there's no statistician on board, this will be a problem to people looking at your application. And you need to have eligible institutional support. The sponsorship of a research project is quite a responsibility, and the institution who's hosting it has to be competent in those duties. Also, in terms of substance, it does, of course, need to be good value for money. Symmetry is another thing I want to talk about. And you may think, oh, what on earth can she mean by that? Well, if we look at a grant application, and I'm sure you're quite familiar with the sorts of subjects and headings that you get in a grant application. This is an example of an eye-for-eye product development, more stage 2. You can see it consists of lots of different bits and pieces. Now, I like to think of these as an aeroplane. All of them are supporting each other. Okay, so if the engine or the motor falls off your aeroplane, it's going to crash. So when you put an application together, you need to think about how all the different parts interlock and relate to each other. And there should be that consistency throughout your application. If we look at the definitions of structure and symmetry, structure is the existing arrangement and mutual relation of constituent parts. Symmetry is talking about harmony of parts with each other and the whole. So what we're looking for is something that, is not contradicting itself, it's consistent, each part reflects the other part. And I think at the heart of that are your aims and objectives. Obviously, the title will reflect the aims and objectives, the two summaries will reflect the aims and objectives, the background and rationale will provide the background and the reasons why you need those aims and objectives. If you dump your aims and objectives into the research plan, you can make sure that you address all of those objectives during the research plan. The outputs and impacts should reflect, obviously, the aims and objectives, as do all the other aspects of your grant application. Thirdly, you need a good story. And again, I think quite often people do think, if my methods are right, it's fine. But actually, if your story, your background rationale does not hold up, if people can't see the point of your research, then they're not going to fund it, no matter how well designed it is. And I think people often neglect this sort of background, this rationale to the story. And if you do look at the background sections of grant applications, you see a very familiar pattern. Firstly, it's saying something is a problem and it's important. So if you remember what Lisa was saying, how to find out and demonstrate the importance of your study. So you're giving evidence for it. It might be prevalence instance, it may be poor patient outcomes or costs. A solution would improve many things. So it's going to reduce the incidence, it's going to improve patient outcomes, it's going to reduce costs. Previous works have shown this and that, including competing products, but this or these are deficient in the following ways. This project will address this knowledge or product gap. It's going to resolve the uncertainty, provide the necessary informational solution. And when all this is done, the problem will be resolved and the impact of this will be X, Y, and Z. So this is the kind of story that you see. And just to demonstrate that you can apply this structure to almost anything, let's have a daft example, a study to evaluate the impact of new lightsaber tech for Jedi Knights on the mortality and morbidity associated with the dark side. And in true academic spirit, I shall give it an acronym. So the dark side is a problem. It causes death in large numbers of people every year and has been even known to exterminate whole planetary populations. In addition, it causes much anxiety and depression. The costs are enormous, both for victims, but also in rebuilding lives and civilizations affected. Removal of the dark side would be beneficial to many millions of people. It would reduce suffering and death and reduce costs to the NHS and other health and social welfare organisations. Current approaches to remove the dark side, such as attacks by small numbers of disorganised rebels, have failed. There is a clear need for a more radical and magical solution. Preliminary studies indicate the potential of new lightsaber tech for Jedi Knights in tackling the dark side, but its full efficacy effectiveness is unknown. This project will evaluate whether or not new lightsaber tech for Jedi Knights is effective in fighting the dark side. If this approach is found to be beneficial, the dark side may be successfully defeated, with resulting improvements in quality of life and longevity throughout the galaxy. And that is until another Jedi Knight goes AWOL, because we know they're all horribly unreliable. So a bit more seriously here, what's the argument? This is an example taken from the i4i web page. It's talking about a bit of kit tech for dealing with osteoarthritis. So it's firstly stating the problem. 370 million people suffer from knee osteoarthritis globally. It causes much pain and disability. Current treatment is major surgery, but this treatment has complications and is rarely suitable for the 7 billion OA patients under 60. So it's basically saying we've got a problem. Fibrofix cartilage implants could improve and provide an alternative to TKR. Patients could benefit from prolonged use of the joint, increased mobility, reduced pain, and postponement or prevention of TKR. TKR is currently the only procedure available. Early work on Fibrofix implants have shown positive results. They are inexpensive and do not require major surgery. However, we need to finish laboratory trials to show they're safe and effective before moving on to a definitive clinical trial. We also need to develop a surgical technique and trial instruments to implant Fibrofix cartilage. The project aims to complete final testing of the implants in laboratory trials, demonstrating they're safe and effective, and will develop the surgical technique and trial instruments to implant Fibrofix cartilage. Following this work, we will conduct a clinical trial. If this shows positive results, we will improve the outcomes of a large number of patients who are currently poorly served by existing techniques. So what we have here is the problem and its importance, talking about current interventions and how they're not suitable. We're introducing a solution in the form of this new implant, which could lead to better outcomes. We're talking about the knowledge gap or the product gap. There are no alternatives, but prior work has shown the potential of this technology. And then we're stating what the project will do. It's addressing the knowledge gap. And then afterwards, they're saying, well, if this provides a solution to the problem, obviously with a bit more further work in this case, it could actually be a massive bonus to the NHS to have this tech that will enable people perhaps to avoid an operation and will certainly keep them going for a lot longer without having to have major surgery. All the things I've stated there are what I would call convincing arguments. So these are the things you want reviewers to remember. You remember earlier I talked a bit about not shoving things under the carpet, those niggles, those bubbles that will remain in a reviewer's head. And you've got to get rid of them. And that's where defensive arguments come in. And that's where we deal with the problems that are raised or mitigate the issues that a reviewer might be having in their head. So, for example, although we're only collecting data from a couple of counties, data from the ONS show that the socio-demographic profile to be very similar to national averages. So it's countering a reviewer's concern that only gathering data in 2 counties might not be representative of a national population, and the results may not be generally generalizable view, saying, no, hang on a minute, actually, the profile is very similar. And that means the reviewer can forget about that niggle, and importantly, it won't be in their head when it gets to the decision making. Fourthly, style is important. We're often told, and obviously with the horrendous word counts, we're often faced with grant applications not to repeat messages. But actually, I've already said that not everybody reads every section, and some people read them very quickly. So if you've got some really important things to get across, it's worth repeating them, perhaps in every section. This is an example from quite a technical career development fellowship from a long time ago. But if you notice, Antonia is including reference to her extensive prior work in virtually every section. So in the scientific summary, she talks about preliminary results in the relevant expertise section. She talks about building on extensive prior work in the introduction. She talks about prior work in the background. She talks about existing system prototypes at the end of the research plan. She talks about extensive prior work in relation to prior work, talks about first prototypes development under ethics issues, and the existing diagnostic system prototype in IP. So even if you were speed reading or reading bits of that application, you will certainly get the message that this product is well on the way to answering the problem, and therefore a part of the success criterion it's going to deliver at the end of the day. Keep things memorable. So don't overwhelm people with information. I believe, I'm told, there's some sort of psychological magic number 7. So if you are having bullet pointed lists, don't have more than 7. You can chunk related information together so that people can remember it. And this is just an example from a DRF application. Keep it easy to read. So headline messages, not convoluted arguments. Use adjectives and adverbs sparingly. We're not writing literary fiction here. We're trying to write something very simple. Use simple structures. It's often told that using the present tense can reduce your word count, and it's a very direct way of getting your message across. Do not use typography to emphasize too much text. If you're a speed reader, having an emboldened word in the middle of a paragraph is really off-putting. If it's important, put it at the start, and I'll talk a bit about that later. Use bullet points and numbered lists. That's very good for keeping your word count down. Short sentences, short paragraphs, simple punctuation. If you find you're using colons or semicolons, get rid of them and put a full stop. This is a literary interlude for you. I'm going to take a deep breath. In consideration of the day and hour of my birth, it was declared by the nurse and by some sage women in the neighbourhood who have taken a lively interest in me several months before there was any opportunity of us becoming personally acquainted. First, that I was destined to be unlucky in life, and secondly, that I was privileged to see ghosts and spirits. Both of these guests inevitably attaching, as they believed, to all unlucky infants of either gender born towards small hours on Friday night. That is the first paragraph of a very famous novel. It's also the first sentence of a very famous novel, is in fact the first sentence and the first paragraph of David Copperfield. I've got another one for you here. Mia groaned. She hated that word. Learning was the thing her mother valued above all else, but to Mia, learning was just boring. I don't suppose anyone will know where that comes from, but it is one of my daughter's favourite books, Gwyneth Rees, Cosmo and the Magic Sneeze. And I think the message I'm trying to get across to you here is write in a simple way, as perhaps you would for a children's writer, if you've got an audience who wants to understand quickly what's going on. If you look at children's authors, they write in a very direct way compared to the more literary novelists who are going to employ all sorts of tricksy and lengthy descriptions of things. So short sentences, to the point, not wandering sentences that go on for a long time. Again, keeping it easy to read, breathing space and subheadings. Nowadays, funders are quite good at saying you've got to have 12 point and you can have no more than 3 pages. So it stops the dreaded, 9 point, absolutely no gaps. But you can see that for a reader, this is quite intimidating. If you pop in some breathing spaces, it's immediately more digestible. If you give it, useful and informative subheadings, that's even more helpful. Obviously, funding schemes sometimes do suggest subheadings that you're supposed to use, and obviously you do have to stick to those. But if there's no ban on using further subheadings to divide up and guide the reader, that's always a good thing that can be used. Keep it easy to understand. So if you can, avoid new and specialist acronyms. Exceedingly difficult, I know, when we're working in technical areas. If you do have to use them, make sure they're very well defined and define them more than once in the different sections of a grant application. There's nothing worse than encountering an acronym on page 70, thinking it was defined somewhere between page 19 and 40. It's just really infuriating for readers. And obviously, if people aren't reading every section, they're not going to understand the acronym when it pops up if it was defined in the first section of your application. If you can, limit the use of overly technical language and buzzwords. Again, it's difficult when we're working in a technical area. There are ways in which you can handle them, and I'll be talking about tag phrases later on, where you allow the reader to become familiar with a technical term that's been very well defined early on in the grant application. But if you can, avoid anything that's going to confuse the reader. Be consistent. Again, thinking back to my comments about symmetry and structure. So consistency between sections. I think I've got a bit of geography in my training, and I like this aerial view of a meandering river. Those of you who know about fluvial geomorphology will know that if a meander gets too big and wide, it breaks off from the river altogether and becomes an oxbow lake. And what you sometimes see as a reader of applications, people might state some objectives, and then somehow by the time you've got to the method section, they've morphed into something else, And a very easy way to avoid that is to dump your objectives as a subheading in your methods, and you'll make sure that you are going to respond and remember what it is you're trying to do. Similarly, we need consistency in the use of terms. So directorate, ward, unit, don't define obesity in the first section of your grant application and then refer to overweight later on. People will wonder, well, what does that mean? Be consistent in your use of terms. Another literary interlude for you. There was Eru, the one who in Arda is called a Luvitar, and he made first the Einar, the holy ones that were the offspring of his thought. An example of lots of things being called different things. Does anybody recognize this? It's actually J.R.R. Tolkien, not the Lord of the Rings, but the Silmarillion. If you do read it, bear in mind that there are lots of different groups of people and they all call each other different things. So everyone has about 3 different names, and you need a glossary, a map, and a family tree to actually understand it. Melkor or Morgoth, I don't know. Be logical. So make sure you've got logical arguments. We don't want non sequiturs. We don't want howevers and then and therefores that don't actually make sense. So a logical flow of sentences, paragraphs, and sections, and be careful not to contradict yourself. Just a couple of little poems to remind you not to contradict yourself. I've already demonstrated that, having spelling mistakes and poor grammar is a problem for reviewers. If you do struggle with writing, and lots of people do, make sure you get it proofread by somebody else to pick up on these things. Because whilst we can be, understanding, if we have difficulties with spelling and grammar, at the same time, it just really annoys reviewers, and it doesn't make for good comprehension. So if you can get someone to proofread your application, make sure you do that. Keep it reasonably formal, so you're avoiding contractions like we'll and shan't. Obviously, we use things like I and we in applications and academic papers nowadays, but make sure that anything that you're stating, your opinion actually doesn't matter, but if it's evidenced, it does matter. So, don't say things like, I'm not convinced. Obviously, you've got to let the evidence speak for itself. So watch the way you write. Colloquialisms, metaphors, anything you like to make the plain English summary more comprehensible, because obviously quite often you're trying to translate really tricky and technical ideas, and you have to get that across to people who don't know anything about them. So a few helpful writing techniques, and one which I think really transformed the way I think grant application should be written is assert justify. So we tend to when we write, say we start a paragraph, we'll work up to the last sentence, which is basically the wham bam sentence. There's no point having that at the end of a paragraph because a speed reading reviewer won't see it. So if there's something important, it has to go at the start of the paragraph. So you're making an assertion and then you're justifying it with the evidence rather than the other way around. It's simple and direct. And actually, it's really handy to lift out, the first sentences of your paragraphs to use in summaries. So things like this area of work is under research, current technology does not work well, previous work is limited and lacks methodological rigor, etc. A couple of little literary assert justifies for you. I'm sure someone will know what this is. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. It is Anna Karenina indeed. So, these are fantastic assert justifies. They're basically the first sentence in the book, and actually the rest of the novel, one way or another, deals with that first sentence. So ask yourself, if a speed reading reviewer only reads only the first sentence in each paragraph, will they get the message? And this is an example of an old expertise and experience section. They don't have them anymore in the old CDF that I was referencing earlier. If we look at the first sentence in every paragraph that's been written here, we have first something about a career, building expertise. So she's saying, I already have a career in this area. We then have some qualifications. I am well qualified. She's talking about supervisors encouraging her to be independent. I'm an independent researcher. My results have been published in peer-reviewed journals and presented here and there. I've got a good research track record. I've already successfully supervised students, talking about capacity development. She's talking about a conference that she's organised, an international conference. She's already saying I've got international collaborators in this novel field. She talks about her preliminary results showing the feasibility and potential impact of her work. This project is likely to succeed. Now, if you looked at the assessment criteria for the Career Development Fellowship, every one of these sentences ticks the box of those assessment criteria. So if a reviewer is going through this application, just by reading the first sentence, they know that this person is well suited for this fellowship. If we look at this other sentence here, I don't know if you just want to have a look at that. We can see that the first sentence is a systematic review published in 2007 found 33 early warning score algorithms in use with a high degree of overlap in the vital signs included. Just look at the rest of that paragraph and think, is there a sentence that would make more of an impact and is more important than that sentence? Just look for a few seconds. In fact, a far better sentence to start that paragraph is this one here, which talks about that none of the algorithms are performing well at identifying patients at increased risk of in-hospital death. So if we turn that around, current early warning scores do not perform well at identifying patients at increased risk of in-hospital death due to numerous deficiencies in the methods used to develop them. Okay, so obviously I've borrowed a bit from the sentence above as well, but that's a far more arresting sentence than a systematic review was published in 2007. So think carefully about the position of your sentences in your paragraphs and think speed reader, getting your message across quickly. Priming is another technique where you're basically giving advanced information to the reader that will make them more likely to agree with you. And these could be assert justify sentences, but it's things like, each year 30,000 people suffer from this. So you're obviously priming the reviewer to see something that will address that. Data will be gathered using your priming for a request for resources, previous relevant work by the co-applicant, you're priming for the choice of personnel. If you drive down a motorway and you see this sign, don't drive tired, within a mile or two, you will see a motorway services station. So you're preparing the reader to agree with you later on that something is important or needs to be done. Signposting is helpful. So it tells the reader that important information is coming. It helps to structure and highlight arguments. It allows speed readers to skip or take note and detailed readers to take note if they want to. So in this section, we describe We now set out the state of the art. The following work package will answer these questions. So it may be that if you've got a very technical method section, for example, you have an introductory lay sentence that says, we're now going to go into detail in relation to how the new genetic microarray works or whatever, at which point the lay readers or the speed readers might say, all right, I know the next section will be all difficult for me to read. But the methods, the detailed readers will be diving into that section and they know that's where they have to start diving into the section. So it just alerts the reader as to what's coming. And obviously, when you have very bitty grant applications and sometimes you feel there's a bit of overlap, but you don't want to repeat things, you can refer people to other sections. So for further information on this, see please section, see section 3.1 or whatever. Linking. So again, relating to this idea of logic and consistency running through your application. It helps to connect arguments and maintain the narrative, and can counteract the bitty nature of grant applications. So whilst this previous work has shown encouraging results, there are only 2 studies that have looked specifically at this issue. This work will answer one aspect of the question, however, there remains the issue of, etc. And of course, the thing that you can use to help you do that are your connectives. So make good use of connectives. This is a plain English summary. We can see some very good use of connectives. So we've got a however, we've got an in addition, we've got a yet, and a finally, and importantly. It just helps the reader. It connects the bits of the sentences that you're stringing together in a logical way, and it provides emphasis, etc., where necessary. I mentioned earlier about avoiding technical buzzwords. If you do have to use them, set them up as these kind of tag phrases or labeling, as it's called. So allow the reviewer to become familiar with that term. They can then feel they own that term and they can throw that term around in the way that you can too. As a reviewer of many grant applications, once you get the gist of a client's idea, it may be a technical phrase, and you understand it, you can start using it yourself. So you feel you understand it. If you use the same words throughout, then people will always recognize it as the thing that you're trying to get them to understand. If it's defined well at the start, they'll know what it's all about. So if you do have to use a special kind of word, make sure you use it always in the same way, and allow the reader to get a kind of ownership of it themselves. So, things like, systematic review isn't a very technical term, early warning score. Steve in his application used these terms multiple times, but if he'd called them by something else, it would have completely baffled the reviewer. Fifthly, sales pitch. I thought it'd be really interesting to see what salespeople are told to do, and try and apply that to grant applications. And some of you working in the commercial sector will be familiar with these things. But firstly, know your customers. So know the scope and remit of the funder, follow the guidance notes, respond carefully to commissioned calls. Know your product, so be on top of the literature. Know where what you are offering fits in with the picture, so that idea of all the competing technologies and how yours is better or addresses the deficiencies of prior work. Acknowledge the problems with existing products, and again, being on top of the literature, knowing the evidence gaps. Offer a solution to the problem, so produce an intervention, a product, a study which addresses the problem and the limitations of previous interventions, products, and studies. Likewise, saying why your product is better than other, knowing the limitations and producing something better. Hook your customer, so have a good title and a fantastic plain English summary. Make a good first impression, so no typos, have a great team, a good title, a fantastic plain English summary. Tell a story, so a logically argued background, rationale. Address objections up front, so acknowledge the limitations of your approach and provide mitigation where possible. Differentiate yourself, so have a great team, an original idea, product. Listen and respond to the customer, so respond to reviewers' comments at stage 2 or at interview or your next attempt. Take on board what they said, address it point by point in a sensible way. Don't get all defensive or ignore it. As we learned earlier, I think when Mike was talking, if you do get the same application back and the reviewers' comments have not been addressed, it'll be, oh no, well, we're not going to look any further because they haven't done anything. And dazzle them. So a great team, great idea, and a fantastic grant proposal. It's important, I think, to balance the logic and rigor with a little bit of enthusiasm and passion. I think as academics, clinicians, probably SMEs as well, we tend to be a bit Mr. Spockish, and we want to dot our I's and cross our T's, but obviously having a little feeling of enthusiasm, of importance, of passion is important. So moderate your Mr. Spock with a little bit of Jim Kirk. Summaries. So the importance of the project should be immediately obvious. So we don't want a needle in a haystack. We want a needle and a button like that. So we can't miss it. We absolutely can't miss what's important. The summaries are the first thing that people read, often the plain English summary. You need clear, simple statements, no detailed arguments and justifications. What is the project about? So that's the problem. Why is it important? Why is it important to do it now? Break the project down. How you will deal with it, so that's your plan, and how will people benefit, so the potential impact. It's your elevator pitch, it's your opportunity to get your foot in the door and to engage your reader. If readers aren't engaged at this stage, I have heard people say, I don't bother to read anymore because I don't see that it's important. So it's terribly important to engage people right at the start. That's Phil's foot. So some easy wins, assessment criteria, keep them in mind at all times. Make sure you address them in your application. Follow the guidance. Don't give them the excuse of booting out your application because you've missed a section or an upload. It's just such a waste of effort. Give yourself time to do a good job, include everything requested, get pre-submission reviews from inside and outside of your specialty. Inside because you need to get the details right, and outside because you've got to be able to provide something written that a layperson or someone not specialized in your area can understand. And keep tweaking and adjusting and crafting until your application is a thing of beauty.